Objections to innate mechanism. Studies of Pidgins and Creoles suggest the presence of an innate backup grammar. Now, as we have seen that the studies which have been conducted on Pidgins and Creole, they have highlighted the presence of innate mechanism, and in the light of that, we have already discussed the language bioprogram hypothesis. Researchers who are studying these phenomena, they have been looking at the way in which they can find out the linguistic evidence which enable them to see how these different linguistic processes take place in the form of bioprogram, and as well as how children can take advantage of the language they receive from their environment. The interesting studies that have been conducted in this particular area where certain objections have been raised to the innate mechanism is the Nicaraguan Sign Language. Before 1970s, in the deaf community in Nicaragua, people were very much isolated in terms of communication, and the deaf children, they were enrolled in the language program where the English language was emphasized, but the teachers were not facing a lot of success. Interestingly, children developed their own language with the help of signs, home sign language, in the school playground, in buses, and outside the classroom, through gestures. So they developed their own Pidgin-like form and Creole-like language, which was later on became the subject of study for the linguists. In the light of that, we will now look at some objections that were raised, that how it is connected to the bioprogram and what actually led to the development of Nicaraguan Sign Language. Now, if we see that the children who developed Nicaraguan Sign Language for the purpose of communication, then it is reasonable to ask whether this process of grammaticalization which led to the developing of this sign language, which is NSL, was the manifestation of bioprogram. Now, Kegel in this regard compares NSL to Hawaiian Creole language, which is HCL. Now, in HCL situation, since it was to do with the situation where a lot of immigrants came to Hawaii and they settled there for the purpose of plantation, and children who grew in that environment did not need to access to bioprogram because multiple linguistic and parameter settings were available to choose. Now, in Nicaraguan Sign Language, children needed to access bioprogram to communicate. Their home language system was lacking in structure, and that was the major cause of accessing to the bioprogram. Now, according to Ellman, she believes that there was a robust drive among those children to solve the problem of communication, and therefore they followed the bioprogram, which is the innate system, language or grammar system. Now, Jeckendorf responded that adults also have a robust drive to acquire language, but they acquire Pidgins rather than Creoles. Thus, something beyond a robust drive seems to be necessary. So, according to Jeckendorf and others, that something is basically an innate mechanism for acquiring language. Ellman and colleagues also discussed some very interesting studies, and they gave the reference of Gopnik and her colleagues of a large English family in which half the members have a basically abnormality which was present from the birth, which is congenital difficulty with speech and language, Now, they first reported evidence of a family in which language disorder is based on single dominant gene, a genetic defect. Members of the family have difficulty with the grammatical rules that underlie inflectional morphology, such as plurals and the past tense. They can memorize individual cases, such as paint and painted, but seem unable to generalize the cases into rule. Now, as a consequence, each new case has to be learned anew. In contrast, they have no difficulty with memorizing irregular cases such as went. The evidence of genetic defect is strong. One of the 35 or 31 family members across 3 generations, roughly half had the morphological impairment, and the pattern strongly suggested a single dominant gene. Allman and colleagues agree that the disorder is genetically based, but question whether the disorder is specific to language. So they basically cited the work of Varga Khadam, who found that affected members of this family performed significantly worse than unaffected members, not only on a series of language tests, but also on non-verbal intelligence. Pinker acknowledges that brain of impaired family members are abnormal in more than one area, but he adds that some of impaired family members have intelligence scores in the normal range. Moreover, some test higher than their unimpaired relatives. The observations basically suggest to Pinker that the language impairment is not simply a consequence of a more general cognitive impairment, but rather one of several abilities caused by impairment. Researchers have further conducted in the other scenario beyond one family, and they are interested in the possibility of specific language impairment, which is SLI, and this is an impairment of language that leaves non-verbal cognitive skills more or less normal. For example, Talal in 1998 has found that some children with language deficits have deficits in processing rapid temporal sequence of auditory stimuli, not just speech. When Talal presented these children with speech in which the phonemic transitions were lengthened, their performance improved dramatically. To conclude, the objections to innate language mechanisms are not overruled. Most of the studies converge on the conclusion that some innate linguistic must be present in order for children to acquire language as successfully as most children do.